And it is 5 past. I got stuck because the 2-year-old kid from our neighbor had a new hat, so I had to talk a little bit about it. Here we are. Let's continue. Getting grips of my slide set. Yes, that's the correct one. So the top management perspective that I already promised, and some of you already covered in the comments. But let's have a look. So here's a top-level roadmap for a new company culture. And again, this is I'm presenting you with a practitioner's point of view, and then giving you references to studies and everything else at the end of the lecture to give you, to literally give you references of it. So this again goes to my background of consultancy and with the bearing point people, putting together that once we had this exceptional expertise over there of typically how it looks like. So pretty much a lot of things that are obvious, but want to really go out and hammer in that these obvious points, and kind of once the obvious is stated, helping you to take it forward. So kind of 6 steps of what typically transformation looks like from management point of view. And of course, like I said, there's a lot of these studies. Change management has been there for decades, so there's nothing new about this. And how do you actually do this in practice has been studied quite a lot. So that coming up. And this is something that I guess already was put in the chat, the top-level desire for change, which just means that if the very top people are not ready to change or don't believe in it, then, is there any point to continue? Or I have these slogans here, is that these are the, if you're working for the company or the organization, this is the question to ask as an employer. You want me to change? So the question for the top management, are you ready to change yourself? And typically the difficulties in this is that once we start transforming into a new kind of a responsive, lean, agile company culture, of course, the whole learnings and experiments that are required for change, what's the attitude towards them? Are they considered an investment in the future, or are they away from our revenue? So how does top management talk about these things? How are they calculated and counted? And then kind of another obvious thing is that obviously change requires taking risks. So how much is, how is failure encouraged? How is it accepted? Which is just the age-old question of how do you encourage people to take risks individually, in a group, big risks, all of that. And then if we believe a lot in experts having autonomy and grassroots having power, that means that somebody needs to give away some of that power. So, okay, let's go there. The top management is willing to change. Maybe like the example was that hired a new CEO, or sometimes happens that there's like a chief digital officer hired especially for this purpose of changing the company to the digital age. Step number 2, strategy and a vision. So again, as an employer, I think a fair question is that, okay, you want me to change? Can you please, boss person, tell me change to what? Which is another way of saying, what's your vision and how are we going to get there? And answering kind of school book question from any strategy manual. Can you should be able to understand how is the industry changing that you work in and who is making the change? What about the customers? Who do they want to become? How are they changing? Explaining this to people, the smart individuals you want to change. And what's our kind of strategic stance? Are we, shaping the market, or are we reacting to the market? All of these basic questions. And especially that what, a typical strategy document, do you have the courage to say that this is something we're not going to do? And as an example, again, hello to the Wärtsilä people out there. I think this is a good example from Wärtsilä, what has happened, that they formed a new vision and then a strategy how to reach this. Just as an example, this is kind of their vision, probably has been updated maybe a little bit, but probably not much, to understand the whole ecosystem thinking and the smartness that comes with ICT and everything. Step number 3, supportive structures. So now we have top management motivation, strategy and the vision. So the next question is, do you want me to change? How will you support this? And I think this just comes up very often in everyday life, whether I'm looking at my own job at the university or, lately I've been talking with high school teachers and the high school organizations in Finland. Everybody wants change. Everybody wants things to be great. But the question is, okay, how are you going to support this? What kind of structures are you going to build that support the change? What kind of decision-making principles should we have? That's a little bit abstract. But for example, simple stuff like how are we going to measure success? How are you going to measure that we are changing to the right direction? Now that's a structure that will shape a lot of things when that is implemented. And basic stuff, governance models, portfolios, reporting models. How is communication going? How are you going to change these? Or are you going to build new structures that's, help us to change? And capabilities and competencies. So that's step number 4. Again, desire for change, vision, supporting structures. So the next question becomes, can we change? Do we have the capabilities to change into that vision? Do we have the competencies to change there? And again, my simple question is that, especially for individuals, and again, this really reminds me of the talks I had with high school teachers, was that there's this, I think, a very human concern that if you want us to become a new kind of a high school organization, do I as an individual need to become something new? Do I need to learn new things? Am I valued anymore? Is my competence valued? And that's kind of, personal psychology questions. On an organization level, it means these. Capabilities are not only people, they're the systems and infrastructure that you have. And what legacy systems we will keep? Which ones will we rebuild? Recruitment, that's an obviously good question when it comes to changing culture and building new capabilities, competencies. Training and education, similar thing. How are we going to change the people that we are trying to change? Training and education and recruitment are the obvious processes for that. And then we have these technologies popping up that I mentioned last week. What are we going to do about them? Do you have a plan? You should. So once we have the structures and then we have an idea with capabilities and competencies, the top management is looking, then the next question would be that what are the first steps? What kind of pilot programs we're having? Or, the ambassadors here mean that who are the people that we change first? And my simple question is that, okay, you want me to change? So what are the first steps that I take? People understand that change doesn't happen with a snap of fingers. It requires certain steps. So what's the very first step? Where do we start? And this is something that has been happening quite a lot in large companies. I guess always, but definitely in the past 5 to 10 years, are different kind of pilot programs that take a new way of working, experimentation programs, agility, agile culture programs, kind of experiments and spearheads and all of this. So the question is that how are we going to do that? And when people try new things out, are they going to be strategically important stuff? Or are they going to be something that is not important? And you can obviously understand that if the top management gives something very important for new experimentation, new way of working, or new kind of an organization, then it kind of gives a signal that they're serious about it. And things like that in the list you can see there. If you have ever wondered at why are big companies doing hackathons or having competitions with students and all of that kind of things, that's partly this, trying out things and seeing what works, and also, of course, recruiting new people and building the capabilities with it. And still, when there was good old slush before the pandemic, if you were there in the past couple of years, you saw that it was, well, I could say it's taken over by large corporations, but at least this in Finland, it isn't only, it's not just a startup and investor meeting place anymore, but it's really for large companies to showcase that they are changing. They are building a new culture, showing their capabilities, at the same time recruiting new capabilities, showing that they're experimenting at all of this and all of this. And then the final question is, how do you scale up? So if we did the first steps, the question is, what are the 2, 3, and 4 steps? So let's say that we have a company of 10,000 people. We ran a program that included 50 people who did something new in a new way, a pilot program. So how about the rest of the people? How does it scale up? How do you organize it? How do you communicate the results and the success while this change is happening? How do you communicate the change? How do you gather the learnings? The people are, the pioneers are doing stuff. How do you gather all that back and shift the whole project with the information gathered there and the learnings? And just going back to the success criteria, which I'm a huge believer of, that once you start writing down the definition of success, it's actually a very powerful tool of communicating what are we trying to achieve. Not that necessarily easy to measure, but it's a great exercise. And again, my example comes from Yle because I'm so familiar with it. So what they started doing was that actually publishing a lot of their experiences, giving away. Like I said, they're a publicly funded company, which kind of makes them obvious for them that they give away the tools, they give away their learnings. They start organizing events such as this one to let anybody, learn, and they bring speakers from abroad, and literally anybody in Finland can check out those talks and learn about it. So that's a way of scaling up. That's a way of communicating. And in my experience, when people communicate outside, for example, like the Yle example here, or Slush when the big companies are there, actually I would say majority of the audience is the internal employees. So you go outside and you're proud of what you've done and you communicate the message to the public, to the media, but it's super important, actually even I would say more important internally for the people working there to see that, okay, this is what we're doing. We're actually going out there to the public to tell what we are doing. This must be important, and that facilitates the change. That was the 6 steps. Let's see what's in the chat. I'll let you digest a little bit or ask questions. Inside out, outside in, both at the same time. That's that's an excellent point, Christina, and thanks for Pia also underlining it. That's you as a change agent should be able to handle both. And understanding that which one is, change probably happens inside out, but the vision that you're aiming for should be, always communicated as an outside in thing. How do you ensure that I have time for the change? Yeah, that comes up soon when I'm asking you to think about what are the typical things that make all of this difficult. So, Christina, that's one thing. Where do people come up with all of this time to learn and change and think and reflect? I'm just going to say that the high school teachers is brilliant. So I was talking with the Finnish Opetushallitus, which is the government body that kind of helps all the Finnish high schools about their education. And we talked about transforming the high schools as an organization, and everything they mentioned, you could just, the 6 steps and the stuff I talked before the break is precisely the things they're challenging with. And they're not a business, they are a high school, they're a public sector organization. So that's kind of, again, I'm just give as an example saying that these are, I hesitate to say universal, but these don't change whether you're a business. This is about organization. How do high schools change, and what's the psychology of the individual, the teacher, who is of course an expert, highly educated expert? How do they think about the change, and how the culture and everything, the supporting structures So for example, the teachers have a very particular contract about how their salary is paid that reflects on their attitudes of where do they find the time to learn and educate themselves. Small details like that. Let's see. What's my experience? How vulnerable do top managers tend to show themselves in the face of change? Well, I think those of you who have been working in different places for many, many years, the people are very different. Top management people are different, and there are different ways of doing it. Some of them kind of radiate confidence, and if they're very confident, they don't hesitate to show their mistakes and their uncertainty. And I think that could be counted as a good characteristic of a leader. I actually have down the line, maybe I have this kind of little stereotypes of change leadership that we might want to go through in the last lectures if we have time, just to show that there's so many ways of facilitating change. And that's one of the things that Jari and myself want to kind of give away from the whole course, is that there's no one way of facilitation. And part of a good facilitator and a leader is that you're quite conscious about your own personal style and strength and weaknesses, and that's how you build your style of facilitation, because it's so very much about social interaction and building trust towards people. And if you want to build trust, then it's, if you are yourself, then that easily starts building the trust aspect of it.
And Risto, can I add something here?
Yeah.
There is, of course, always this change is something that it's always a learning process as well. So we can't know in advance everything that, or plan that now everything happens like that. So it's something we have to start and then probe and reflect on and be patient. And there is back and forth moments, and every context is unique in that sense, that we should be able to probe in our own organization and then really to learn how it happens here. Because, and of course, there is some universal, let's say, how we add probability for success, but then it's always unique process.
Yeah. I'm picking here, Rauli is asking, what's the role of organizational communication? So actually, I want to say that I think it's huge. Just kind of what I was emphasizing as well, that communicating, I guess this is kind of all, this is the fact that it's so much about communicating things, perhaps even more than actually having the results. It's just literally the fact that if the tree falls and nobody hears about it, if the company does this experiment and shows that we can do this and the rest of the company never learns about it, then did it actually happen? So often I hear that people actually do when they start doing, for example, a vision or a strategy, that they start by communication strategy, and then the actual strategy happens as a side product in a way that, the way that we communicate this and how we make sure that people start working in a different way. And that kind of actually shows us that how we should actually do that change. So maybe putting communication in the driver's seat is one way of thinking about it. Olga, you were asking, how do you calculate the monetary value of the change? Yeah, that's a tough question. What are the costs of doing this change? And what are I guess that goes to the very simple answer that what are the alternatives? And then what are the costs of the alternatives? What are the costs of doing nothing? What are the costs of doing that? And what are the costs of that? Well, thankfully, we have a lot of management consultants to count those things for us. But let's go to the breakout rooms. Let's see if there's one more question. But let's have you. Obviously, you are ready to talk about this. So I'm going to ask you for 10. Let's put 15 minutes. We're nicely on schedule. So 15 minutes altogether. We're going to put you again randomly together. And all of you have different experiences. Some of you have maybe worked in a situation like this for 20 years. Some of you are maybe students who are like, wow, this is the first time I've ever hearing about this thing. But nevertheless, being kind of appreciating that you have different experiences. But even if you are the student who's like first time thinking about organizations in this way, just think about your personal life. You have worked in, you are a student, you're part of an organization. I don't know, maybe you have coached, as a teenager, you coached some kids in a football game or something like that. Then I think those are exactly the leadership experiences that are reflected in any kind of organization. So I'm asking you a little bit to think about, yeah, I probably do have some ideas, or most of us, everybody of us have an experience of being asked to change. So being the kind of the employer, the student, all of you students, we as an organization, we are asking you to change in 5 years quite a lot, if you haven't noticed. So have a conversation, give examples, and make sure everybody kind of gets to reflect, and then write down in the chat, in the bullets, what did you find out, figure out, what did you together as talk. I put here, so if you want to take a snapshot of the screen, here are the 6 steps, and then my questions I had for each one, just to help you give a context of what I went through and what you might want to talk about. Okay, Kiara Lee, ready to transport people. Okay, welcome back. Let's do so that please do exactly what Otso did. Otso, you win a prize. First one in the chat. And Jelske now second. Write down what you found, but let's take one or two. Let's take at least one. Anybody want to volunteer? Any insights? Anything interesting you talked about in your group? Just scream aloud and see what happens.
Group 18. We realized that change actually begins in the coffee shop floor, and it's can be sometimes slow to proceed. But once the top management finally gives us the founding, it could actually start going faster. And good communication was the key that we found.
Yeah, thanks, Jyrki. Yeah.
Thanks.
Anybody have an experience where the change happens from the top management, that the initiative is there, something that was brought up earlier in the chat?
I have.
Christina.
Oh, it was simply that the business realized that it's not competitive anymore unless it's going to change. And we had a huge kind of a transformation program in a company which started with N and ended with A. So it was in the beginning of, I think, 2010 and 2011 and 2012 in Nokia. Transformation, and it was of course driven by the top management, but unfortunately the cultural change was kind of too late and too slow.
Yeah, I think that's a national case study for all of us.
Yeah, I think there will be more books about that, and I will read them with interest. But I will not write a book. I wasn't so deep in the change, but I was part of the transformation program and working with the consultants. So it was kind of I had a good view. Interesting times.
Yeah, thanks, Christina. Thanks for being here in the course.
I have sorry.
Go ahead, Riikka.
I have another example. I'm working in Aalto, and here the new we adopted like a living strategy, which is like a more dynamic way of making strategy, and that actually came like I'm not sure I can say came directly top down, but it was a communication between the strategy professors at Aalto and then top management. So that's like one example from something like that.
Yeah, good example. And as another Aalto employee, there is this kind of balance. At least there's that I feel that it is driven by top management. And with Aalto, we have the luxury of having, strategic professors and leadership experts, but also involving people. I guess that's the goal of it. They're trying to get people involved. Whether we Aalto employees are actively taking part in it and doing our share, I'm not sure. I'm not sure how many times I have participated, for example. feel a little bit guilty. Here are typical what happens in a large organization. I call them corporate roadblocks. And again, you can go like, this is like those bingo games that when you get a bingo, you can have a drink. So if you can find that these in your history, then you can mark that in your bingo, in your roadblock bingo. Governance, PMO. So the kind of the organization structure that is supposed to help, for example, the way that our projects are runs and then, decision making is governed literally. That has, of course, a huge influence of how people are doing things, ways of working, what is valued, what is calculated as valuable, and so forth. Which goes to the next one is the valuation models. So typically, if you're doing a project that says that we're building a new innovation into the future, somebody needs to make the calculations of, or there was literally the question that how do you calculate the cost for change? So that's what's the valuation model? Do you have like cash flow calculations and DCF calculations for innovations, or do you have some kind of different models? And how those what kind of a culture and message do they actually give to the people, which is decision making after all. But I think this is the classical example in your bingo, budgeting. So if budgeting is done once a year, then it's really difficult to be like super agile and make all those somersaults and backflips if budgets are given according to what you are supposed to do, and this is checked once in a year. Well, I'm going to dig further. I'm pretty sure you understand that this kind of sets the clock speed into an annual clock speed. And the principles of budgeting altogether. Portfolio management is my favorite. I have a lecture about that. Let's see if I have time to give it in this course. Because that's where you have every project, like an innovation portfolio. That's where you decide which innovations, how do they interact, how do you value them, how do you budget them, how do you manage them. So it's a super important part of it. This is something we can all easily relate this, which also already came up in the chat as well earlier, is that how do you, where do you get the time to talk with people, listen to people? When people are having discussions in the coffee shop, just like Jyrki, you said, the change starts from there. Is that work time? Are we supposed to do this? Should that be done our lunchtime? What's the message? Again, kind of talking a lot about in the chat about the communication. If you encourage people to have random conversations, then you are communicating a certain message that what is valuable and what is valued in this change. In addition to the fact that we all know that change doesn't happen if people don't have time to discuss and think and reflect, which is something we're going to get back later in this course. And then we go to the very individual person, is that the career models. Now, again, if somebody asks you to change and you're like, well, I kind of like what you're saying, but my salary is based on this. My career path is based on this. How does it fit in here? What are my incentives? Is there, if somebody says that we should become this artificial intelligence technology company, it's like, oh, okay. Is there a career path to become a senior artificial intelligence expert? It goes to very basic structures like that. And again, back to what I mentioned, risk taking. Is it that awarded? How are individual people motivated and helped to take risk in the sphere of influence they have in the organization? And here's the main point again. So from the very top perspective, when you talk about, and I imagine that there are hardly any corporate CEOs in this course, and I would imagine that mostly we are upper middle management or senior experts, a lot of students who are junior experts, let's put it that way. So, and we are looking at the top management, which has a huge influence, obviously, in change. And kind of having empathy, I like the word empathy in the chat, but having empathy both ways, that we who are not running the whole organization, we have empathy towards the boss people. And for them, this is a holistic project. It's not just an agile lean thingy. It includes everything that we have been talking about. And that's a big, big thing. That's a big, big change. And I think at least we should be very conscious and aware of it. This is kind of just a practical, you can take a business management book and see that how organizations and businesses are run. So in top of this, kind of all the lenses and context and being aware of all of these and the complexities involved is very important. Good. Let's go to the exercise that we're going to give you. And this has the exciting name of temporal onion. So we take the onion, but we take a timeline with it. Yeah, a very strange metaphor to have a temporal onion, but bear with me. Deadline next week. And if you run into problems such as you don't get a pair or something like that, sure, we're going to give you an extension. Don't worry about it. We want you to do the exercise. It's more important that you do the exercise than the actually getting the deadline. But we human beings work with deadlines. That's why we give you deadlines. Here we go. So drawing and asking your pair about the time context, the temporal context, in all simplicity, before, during, after. What do I mean by this? Here we go. Here's the last week and the onion, which is static. And the point being, now thinking about what is success? How am I successful in my work? How do I achieve the goals and objectives that we are supposed to do? And the point last week with the onion was that success is always defined by the next layer of the onion. My individual success is not defined by me, but it's defined by the next layer. My boss, my team. The success of my team is pretty much defined by the next layer, the bigger organization, because the team is part of the larger organization, and so forth, and so forth, and so forth. And the success of the whole company is obviously decided by outside the market. How does it work? So the point being that the static we made you draw last week, that's static. The onion is static. It doesn't imply change. It just helps you understand the context in a static way. So how do we draw it in a timeline? So here's the thinking. The idea that if you have a project, an individual workshop, or anything you're working with, let's use the word project because typically projects have a beginning and an end. Well, the simple thing, we're making you think that it comes from somewhere, and probably it comes from the bigger context of the onion. And once the project is finished, it is supposed to have an impact outside your own bubble. So let's, draw it very simply like this. Your project, it comes from somewhere. Somebody probably gives you it. It has a history. And once the project is done, it's supposed to have an impact somewhere. And the point again is that your success, whether the project you're running, small or large, is defined after the project is done, isn't it? It's defined somewhere here. Because your project is done to create an impact, and the impact, kind of by definition, happens after the project is done. So here's your project. It has the beginning, it has some kind of a context, and it has an end. And there you have some kind of a definition. Now the project is done, and the resources are spent, and we move to the next project. Now, this is, of course, how we typically think about projects. But being a little bit critical here is that this is kind of navel gazing in a small picture. It's kind of very selfish, to be provocative, because it doesn't care about other people's goals. This is just looking at our own individual project in a very limited sense. It begins here and ends here, and that's it. I move on. But of course, the real world, your project is part of a longer timeline. And this is the thinking that we're pushing you to do this week about your project. So the exercise is going to be, I'm going to have a slide about it, but the exercise is going to be that think about a project, and then the other person is going to ask you questions more or less within this timeline. So one of the sparring questions about your project is that, do you have an idea Or have you even written down what has happened 1 year after the project for it to have been successful? Let's call this the desired impact. Then we can start working, if that's the very first question, let's start working backwards from that. So if that's the desired impact, say after a year, if that makes sense. So what needs to be happened after 6 months? What has happened 6 months after you finished your project so that your project can be said to be successful? And then going back, what about 1 month? Think about it. The project you're working, what needs to have happened 1 month after you stopped working so that you could go and say, yeah, we had an impact. And then, of course, going back, what do we need to have to reach? What do we need to have ready at the end of the project so we can be sure that the impact we desire in 1 month happens, and so forth and so on. And not stopping there, they're going back into the past. So understanding about your project, what's our history? Where does it come from? The simple thing, what exists already, kind of basic stuff that you probably already do when you start a new project. Has somebody done something similar before in our company, outside, something else? And then, of course, that gives you an idea of what needs to be ready even before we start. What do we need to understand about the history, about the context, about the definition of success? So once we take this kind of a thinking, that we all actually start thinking about the project 1 year after it is done, and then, backpedal all the way to the history. That gives us a time context for the project. We have some kind of an idea, where do we come from, and we have an idea that what should happen year, 2 years, 3 years, 6 months after we have done. And that's, of course, thinking about the impact that we desire with the project. And that's kind of the next level of thinking when you do stuff or anything. That's the change. And again, this might sound very childish. This might sound very obvious. The tool, the thing we're asking you to do again, it's like kind of like, is it that? Why are you asking to do simple things like that? But here's the thing, just like last week, don't get fixated on this tool. Don't look at the tool and go like, wow, this is as stupid as last week. This is just drawing things, but now in a timeline. Last year it was in an onion. But when we ask you to do this again as a pair exercise, you are drawing the picture from the other person's project. You need to start asking questions. You need to start understanding a lot of things. And both of you start paying attention to the facilitation process. What seems to be hard to understand? Is it difficult to figure out what happens 1 month or 1 year after the done? What in this exercise is actually complex? It's not the tool, it's the thing that this tool surfaces in the conversations you're having together. That's the magic stuff here. And once you start understanding that, just like last week's comments, that there was this one comment that's like, wow, we just realized that you don't really understand what your company is doing. That you are the stone layer who's just building bricks and not understanding that this is a cathedral. You're kind of hoping that in a similar way, this pushes you to see stuff that you wouldn't see otherwise, and then trying to understand the root causes of it. So here it is, the one slider, and you can obviously get this very soon. But pretty much I went over. Again, remember to reflect together. I think that's very important for you and super interesting for all of us as well. But really, it's more important for you because you're doing these exercises for yourself, not for us. So again, just like last week, do it for the other person, switch roles, and then reflect. And then write us a little summary of your reflection and show us, and take us, a picture of the diagrams you did. It says here, return your drawings and reflections to the email. Actually, I realized don't do that. Kiera and Lee are going to send you a link. But you're going to get an email, and if you don't, ask us and we will send you the instructions. That's it, almost done. Don't quit yet. Further readings, like I said, there's a bunch here. The first one is a blog post, very easy to read, and then a handful of different articles for those of you who want to dig deeper. And then especially thinking about you students out there. So here are actually 4 master's theses from last year that are looking at the stuff that we talked here today. Especially if you wanted the second one is about the Yle transformation. That's a whole master's thesis about it. The first one is about the startup that I mentioned and their organization design. But also those 2 other ones are super interesting and very good theses about transformation in organizations. And that's it. Remember to check your attendance. And you can see in the chat, Kiara already sent you the links, attendance form. We're going to put everything again on the Medium page. You can find the videos there. You can find the lecture slides there, and probably something else as well. But that's the place to go. Some of you asked, why don't we use my courses? Well, the fact is that not everybody has access to my courses, so we're putting them on Medium to be easily available. That's it. 6 o'clock, right on time. I'm proud about my timing.